The first cut came before the frost was off the grass. A woman of 74, out among the apple trees in a man's canvas coat, taking a bow saw to limbs that looked to everyone else like the best wood on the tree. She worked slow. She dropped good branches in the wet leaves and left them lying where they fell. When her neighbors drove past on Route H and saw the pale scars up and down her orchard, they slowed to look, then drove on, shaking their heads. Hetty Cade was cutting the heart out of a bearing orchard, and she would not say why. Somebody asked her straight out at the feed store. She told them the trees would explain it themselves when the time came, and that was all she would give them. She did not argue the point. She did not defend it. She let them think what they liked. Nobody in Shannon County knew what the old woman was after. But before 2 winters were gone, they would. If stories of quiet wisdom, patience, and the old ways of working the land mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every one. The Cade place sat on Lick Branch, back off the gravel where the hollow narrows and the light comes late. Her people had put the first trees in the ground in 1911, grafted stock hauled in by wagon, and some of those old trunks still bore, thick as a barrel and leaning south. 9 acres of apples, more or less, run half wild in the lean years. In fall, the whole draw smelled of windfalls and wood smoke and the cold coming down off the ridge at night. She was no orchardist. She had kept a garden, raised 3 children, and buried a husband on the hill above the branch. What she had was a habit of watching. Her daughter-in-law, Ivy, kept the finest kitchen garden in the county, on ground that grew mostly rock. And even Ivy allowed that Hetty could look at a thing longer than any living soul. Years back, she had marked which trees dropped limbs in a wet snow, and which never did. She had marked the dark line in the fork of a crowded limb, where 2 branches pressed together and the bark grew trapped between them. She kept these things to herself and thought on them. Boyd Lusk farmed the next place down and had known her 40 years. He leaned on her gate one morning while she was taking the top out of a young tree and asked, kind as could be, whether she'd finally lost her hold on things. There was no cruelty in it. He was honest puzzled, the way you are when someone you respect does a thing with no sense in it. He told it around, and folks laughed, more baffled than mean, at an old woman sawing the tops out of good apple trees. Her sister Fern said it plainest, over coffee. It's just trees, Hetty. The ice and the wind will take what they want, and no saw of yours will change their minds. Hetty filled the cup and said nothing. Her son Grady thought the same, though he didn't say it. He watched from the cab of his truck through most of that first winter, the engine running for the heat, while his mother worked the rows in the cold. He did not stop her. In their family, you did not stop a body from their own foolishness. You waited, and you watched. Here is where she had got it, though she told no one for a long while. The winter before, cleaning out the back room of the farmhouse, she had found a thin bulletin gone soft with damp, printed by the State College's fruit station some 60 years earlier. Pomology, the cover said, a word she had to sound out slow. Inside, in plain type, a long-dead professor set down how a young apple tree ought to be trained. 1 strong central stem, scaffold limbs spaced up the trunk, each leaving the trunk wide, near a right angle, so the wood at the joint grew thick and sound. And a warning, underlined by some earlier hand, never let 2 limbs of a size climb up together, crowding each other, for the bark grows trapped in the seam between them, and that seam will not hold. She read it by the lamp until she had it by heart. Then she went out the next morning and looked at her own trees with new eyes and saw the seams everywhere, dark lines running down 100 crowded forks, trees loaded with fruit and full of a weakness she had never named. She told no one. She took down the saw. The whole of it was simpler than the neighbors guessed. A limb that grows straight out from the trunk carries its weight down into good wood and holds. But two limbs of the same size, climbing side by side, cannot both be the trunk. The bark folds in between them instead of knitting and leaves a hidden seam. Load that seam with fruit, or with snow, or with a night of ice, and the tree tears itself apart along the very line where it looked fullest. Hetty was not making her trees prettier. She was taking out every trap before it could be sprung. She was cutting for a storm she could not yet see. It did not go smooth. The first spring she cut a young tree too hard all at once, and it sulked and set almost no fruit, and Boyd made sure to mention it. She learned to take less, and to take it over more than one winter, so the tree never felt robbed. Then the tops got away from her. She was 74 and could not reach the high, crowded wood, and a borrowed pole saw split at the head on the third day out. She stood in the leaves, out of breath, and thought maybe Fern had the right of it. That was the low morning. But the next day Grady, without one word, took the loppers off the nail by the door and started on the far row where the trees stood tallest. He had rigged a longer pole in his shop overnight. He never said he believed her. He just worked. The third trouble was worse. She cut one big fork in warm weather, and the wound wept and cankered, and a borer got in behind it, and she near lost the tree. So she learned the last of it, the part the bulletin only hinted at. Cut in the cold, when the tree sleeps. Cut clean to the swollen collar, so the wound closes over and nothing gets in. After that, her cuts healed pale and tight. By the end of the second winter, the orchard had changed. Where there had been a tangle, now each tree stood open and plain, one clear leader, its limbs reaching out wide and low like a person holding a bowl. To Hetty, it was the soundest thing she had ever made. To everyone else, it was just Hetty's queer, bald trees. The apples came back heavier that fall, though nobody counted them against the cutting. Boyd still shook his head when he drove past. The county paid her odd orchard no more mind than it ever had. The word came in on the 3rd January. A hard rain riding up from the south, and behind it, cold air held down at the ground so the rain would freeze the instant it touched. The radio said it plain. The oldest men at the feed store said the last one like it had come in 1949 and had taken half the timber off the ridges. Hetty felt it before the radio said it. 3 days out, the birds went quiet, and the branch water ran slow and black, and her cattle crowded the low fence and would not settle. The evening before, she walked her rows in the last gray light, with her hand on the cold bark, checking the wide joints she had made, the way you touch a gate you built to be sure it will hold. Then she went in, banked the stove, and listened. It started near midnight, a fine tick against the glass, and by 2, the whole hollow was ringing. Rain froze as it fell. By dawn, every twig in Shannon County wore near 2 inches of clear ice, and the trees had begun to come apart in the dark. It sounded like rifle fire down the branch, a crack, and then a long, tearing groan and a crash, over and over, the whole night through. Silas Muir, 3 farms up, kept the biggest orchard on the branch, 60 trees heavy with unpruned wood, and by daylight, he had lost better than 40 of them. They had split straight down the crowded forks, down the dark seams, each one torn along the exact line where the bark had grown trapped. Boyd lost the big shade maple that had stood over his porch since his father's day. 9 of every 10 yard trees in the county dropped a limb or more. The ridges cracked and thundered like something breaking underground. Hetty's trees bowed to the ground under the ice and shook and held. She lost 2 of the youngest, and 1 old limb she had meant to take that very winter. The rest stood. There were no trapped seams left to tear. The load ran down through the wide, sound joints into good wood, the way the dead professor had promised 60 years before. Silas Muir came down the branch 2 days later. He picked through his own wreckage first, then stood a long while at Hetty's fence with the ice still dripping off the wire. He did not laugh. He had nothing left to laugh with. He looked down her open, standing rows, then back toward his own splintered orchard, and he asked her one thing. He asked how she had known to cut them that way. She went in and brought out the soft old bulletin and put it in his hands. He read it there in the cold, turning it over, and then he asked, quiet, if he might keep it a few days. Nothing was announced. No one owned to having been wrong. But through the winters after, up and down the branch, you could hear saws working in the cold, and the trees began to change. Hetty never told a soul she had known. She said only, once, to Grady, that a tree does not break where the storm is hardest. It breaks where it was never built to hold, and the storm only finds the place. That was as near to boasting as she ever came, and maybe that is the truest harvest of a long life. Not the fruit you carry in, which the next season takes back, but the sound shape you leave, worked into living things, the strength set so deep it holds long after your hands are gone, and holds for people who never knew your name. Hetty Cade is 76 now. She still walks the rows every February in the man's canvas coat, loppers in her hand, looking for the dark seam in a crowded fork before it can start. The old bulletin sits on the shelf by the stove. Silas prunes his young trees the way she showed him, and his boy is learning it. And up Lick Branch the orchards stand open to the weather and hold. Thank you for spending this quiet while with us. If Hetty's patience meant something to you tonight, tell us in the comments about someone in your own family who knew the land that way. Subscribe and stay a while. There is another story on the way.